One post changes everything. A congresswoman shares content about a deceased activist that crosses every boundary of decency. The backlash is immediate and fierce. Then Donald Trump enters the conversation. And suddenly Ilhan Omar finds herself facing the fight of her political life. What happened next exposed fundamental truths about modern American politics that go far beyond one controversial moment. I've analyzed political controversies for years, and most follow predictable patterns. They flare up, dominate a news cycle, then disappear. But occasionally something breaks through that pattern, something that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about leadership, values, and the boundaries of acceptable discourse. What unfolded between Omar and Trump was exactly that kind of moment, and the shockwaves are still reverberating through American politics today. To understand why this controversy exploded the way it did, we need to establish what actually happened. Charlie Kirk, founder of Turning Point USA, passed away unexpectedly. Kirk had been a polarizing figure. Conservatives celebrated his youth activism and organizational skills, while progressives criticized his political positions. But death has historically been a moment when Americans set aside political differences to acknowledge shared humanity. That's what made Ilhan Omar's response so jarring. Within hours of Kirk's death being announced, Omar took to social media and amplified content comparing Kirk to Dr. Frankenstein, the fictional scientist destroyed by his own monstrous creation. The metaphor was unmistakable. Kirk had supposedly created something that turned against him, and there was a certain poetic justice in his demise. Stop and process that for a moment. We're not talking about heated policy debates or strong criticism of someone's political positions. We're talking about a sitting member of the United States Congress using a man's death as an opportunity to score political points through dark literary analogy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media platforms erupted with criticism from across the political spectrum. Conservatives were predictably outraged, but the backlash extended far beyond partisan lines. Moderates expressed discomfort. Even some progressives quietly acknowledged that the timing and tone were deeply inappropriate. What Omar apparently didn't anticipate was how this would resonate with average Americans who still hold certain values about respecting the deceased. There's an unwritten social contract in American culture. When someone dies, especially someone with a family, you don't celebrate or mock that death regardless of your political disagreements. Omar's actions violated that contract in a way that felt visceral to millions of people. Her follow-up comments made things worse. Omar doubled down, suggesting that Kirk's legacy deserved to be consigned to the dustbin of history. She framed his work as spreading hate and division, essentially arguing that his death represented an opportunity for progress. This wasn't just poor timing, it was a calculated statement about erasing someone's legacy while their family was still processing grief. The backlash intensified because people recognized this wasn't an isolated incident. Omar has built a political brand on being provocative, on challenging establishment norms, on speaking what she views as uncomfortable truths. But there's a difference between being provocative and being cruel. There's a difference between challenging power and mocking death. Americans across the political spectrum began asking fundamental questions. What happened to basic human decency? When did it become acceptable for elected officials to celebrate or trivialize someone's passing? Where are the boundaries of acceptable political discourse? These questions gained traction because they weren't rooted in partisan talking points. They came from a genuine sense that something important had been violated. When your Republican neighbor and your Democratic coworker both express discomfort with the same political action, that's a signal that the issue transcends normal partisan divisions. The memorial service for Kirk was scheduled to take place at State Farm Stadium in Arizona. Organizers anticipated massive attendance. Estimates ranged from 50,000 to 100,000 people. The actual turnout approached 90,000, making it one of the largest memorial services for a political figure in recent American history. This context matters enormously. Omar made her comments while Kirk's widow was planning how to bury her husband, while his children were trying to process the loss of their father, while tens of thousands of Americans were preparing to honor someone who had impacted their lives. The optics couldn't have been worse. As criticism mounted, Omar's defenders tried various arguments. Some claimed she was being unfairly targeted because of her identity as a Muslim woman of color. Others argued that Kirk himself had been divisive and therefore fair game for harsh criticism even in death. Still others suggested that conservatives were manufacturing outrage for political advantage. None of these defenses gained significant traction outside progressive circles. Why? Because the fundamental issue wasn't about Omar's identity, Kirk's political positions, or partisan calculation. It was about something more basic: human decency in the face of death. The controversy also highlighted an uncomfortable truth about social media and political communication. Platforms like Twitter reward provocation and outrage. They incentivize politicians to make increasingly inflammatory statements to capture attention and energize their base. Omar's post fit perfectly into this dynamic. It was designed to generate engagement, to signal alignment with progressive activists who viewed Kirk as an enemy. But what works on social media doesn't always translate to broader public opinion. The algorithms reward controversy, but voters still maintain certain expectations about character and judgment. Omar discovered this gap the hard way. As the backlash grew, political observers noted that something significant was happening. This wasn't just another news cycle controversy destined to fade away. The intensity and breadth of criticism suggested that Omar had touched a nerve that went deeper than typical political disagreements. Conservative commentators seized on the moment, framing it as evidence of progressive callousness and moral bankruptcy. But the more damaging criticism came from unexpected sources: moderate Democrats expressing private discomfort, independent voters questioning Omar's judgment, and even some progressive voices acknowledging that she had gone too far. The cultural significance of respecting the deceased cannot be overstated in American society. Funerals and memorial services serve as moments of communal grieving, opportunities to set aside differences and acknowledge shared loss. This tradition crosses religious, ethnic, and political boundaries. It's one of the few remaining social rituals that still commands widespread respect. Omar's violation of this norm struck many Americans as evidence of a broader cultural breakdown. If we can't even agree to show basic respect when someone dies, what common ground remains? If elected officials feel comfortable mocking the deceased for political advantage, what values still bind us together as a society? The stage was set for what would become one of the most consequential political confrontations in recent memory. Omar had provided her critics with ammunition, violated widely held social norms, and exposed herself to attacks on character and judgment. All that was needed was someone willing to exploit that vulnerability decisively. Enter Donald Trump. Donald Trump has never been one to let a political opportunity pass by unused. When he saw the backlash building against Omar, he recognized exactly what he had: a chance to reframe an entire narrative while positioning himself as the defender of American values and basic human decency. Trump's response came via Truth Social, his preferred social media platform. But this wasn't just another off-the-cuff post or impulsive reaction. It was a carefully constructed political attack that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. First, Trump focused on the moral dimension. He contrasted Omar's comments about Kirk with the values that most Americans claim to hold. He talked about respecting the deceased, supporting grieving families, and maintaining certain boundaries even in political disagreement. By framing the issue this way, Trump positioned himself as the voice of common decency against Omar's apparent callousness. This moral framing was strategically brilliant. It allowed Trump to take the high ground, not an easy position for someone known for his own controversial statements. But in this case, the contrast was clear. Trump was defending traditional values of respect for the dead, while Omar had violated those values. The optics were powerful and difficult for her defenders to counter. Second, Trump pivoted to questions of loyalty and belonging. He brought up Omar's background as a Somali refugee who became an American citizen. He referenced Somalia's challenges: extreme poverty affecting roughly 70% of the population, systemic government corruption, ongoing conflict, and basic infrastructure failures. Trump's argument was straightforward. How does someone from a country facing such enormous challenges position themselves as a moral authority on American governance? It was a classic Trump rhetorical move, taking his opponent's claimed moral superiority and flipping it into a vulnerability. This line of attack resonated with a specific segment of American voters who have long questioned whether certain progressive politicians truly appreciate American institutions and values. For these voters, Omar represented someone who seemed more interested in criticizing America than in acknowledging its virtues. Trump's framing reinforced that perception. The contrast Trump drew was deliberate and calculated. He painted a picture of Somalia as a failed state, a place where basic governmental functions don't work, where corruption is endemic, where citizens live in poverty and fear. Then he juxtaposed that with America, a nation that, despite its problems, remains a beacon of opportunity and stability. The implicit question was devastating. Why should Americans take governance advice from someone whose homeland couldn't even provide basic services? Then came the most controversial element of Trump's response. He raised allegations about Omar's marriage history. Specifically, he referenced long-circulating claims that she had married a family member to facilitate immigration status. Wasn't she the one who married her brother to gain citizenship? Trump wrote, bringing what had been largely relegated to fringe discussions into mainstream political discourse. This was a calculated escalation. Trump knew these allegations had been investigated by some journalists but never definitively proven or disproven. By raising them in this context, he accomplished several objectives simultaneously. First, he put Omar on the defensive about her personal history rather than her comments about Kirk. Second, he planted seeds of doubt about her credibility and character. Third, he gave conservative media and his supporters a new line of attack to pursue. And fourth, he forced mainstream media to address questions they had largely avoided. The framing around citizenship and loyalty was particularly potent. Trump wasn't just asking whether Omar had committed immigration fraud, he was questioning whether someone with potentially dubious citizenship credentials had the moral authority to lecture Americans about values and governance. It was a devastating line of attack precisely because it struck at the heart of Omar's political identity. Omar's defenders immediately cried foul, calling Trump's tactics racist, xenophobic, and an attempt to delegitimize a Muslim woman in Congress. These accusations had merit in terms of the broader pattern of how Trump had previously attacked Omar and other progressive women of color in Congress. But in this specific instance, the defensive response fell flat with many Americans. Why? Because Trump was responding to Omar's own controversial statements. She had initiated the controversy by mocking Kirk's death. Trump's counterpunch, while harsh, came in a context where Omar had already demonstrated questionable judgment. The brilliance of Trump's strategy was that he turned what could have been a defensive position, responding to criticism of political allies, into an offensive position questioning Omar's character, judgment, and credibility. Instead of defending Kirk or conservatives generally, Trump made the conversation about Omar's fitness for office. Trump also understood the power of timing. He announced that he would be attending Kirk's memorial service, turning the event into an opportunity to demonstrate presidential bearing and empathy. The visual contrast was unmistakable. Trump standing with a grieving family, speaking to tens of thousands of mourners, positioning himself as a unifying figure, all while Omar's controversial comments hung in the air. This kind of political jiu-jitsu, using an opponent's attack to demonstrate your own strength, is a Trump hallmark. He's done it throughout his political career, and it's one reason why his supporters view him as a master tactician, while his opponents see him as dangerously manipulative. The media coverage of Trump's response was intense and divided. Conservative outlets praised his willingness to confront what they saw as Omar's moral bankruptcy. Progressive outlets condemned his rhetoric as divisive and potentially dangerous. Mainstream outlets struggled to cover the story in a way that acknowledged both Omar's controversial comments and Trump's harsh response. What got lost in much of the coverage was how effective Trump's strategy actually was in political terms. He had successfully reframed the entire conversation. Instead of debating Kirk's legacy or conservative activism, Americans were now debating Omar's character, judgment, and loyalty. That's a significant strategic victory. Trump also demonstrated something important about modern political communication. The willingness to escalate and dominate a narrative often matters more than the specific facts at hand. By raising questions about Omar's citizenship and marriage history, true or not, he ensured that she would spend weeks responding to allegations rather than advancing her own political agenda. The deportation rhetoric Trump employed served multiple purposes. On one level, it was red meat for his base, supporters who wanted to see aggressive action against politicians they viewed as un-American. On another level, it was psychological warfare against Omar, forcing her to publicly defend her citizenship and belonging in a way that appeared desperate and defensive. Trump understood that the legal reality of whether Omar could actually be deported mattered less than the symbolic power of questioning her right to be in America at all. By raising deportation as even a theoretical possibility, he positioned Omar as fundamentally outside the American mainstream, as someone whose presence in Congress was somehow illegitimate or provisional. As Trump's response circulated and gained traction, Omar faced a critical decision: how to respond to attacks that were both personal and political, that questioned both her judgment and her fundamental legitimacy as an American citizen and elected official. Ilhan Omar's response to the mounting controversy revealed something crucial about modern political crises. How you respond often matters more than the initial mistake. Omar's handling of the backlash became a masterclass in what not to do when facing intense scrutiny. Her first major media appearance after Trump's counterattack came on CNN with Caitlin Collins. Political observers anticipated that Omar would use this opportunity to clarify her position, express some form of regret for her timing, and pivot back to her policy agenda. Instead, viewers witnessed a politician who appeared rattled, defensive, and increasingly desperate to change the subject. When Collins pressed her about the Frankenstein comparison, Omar initially tried to distance herself from the content. She argued that sharing something on social media doesn't mean you endorse every word or sentiment contained within it. This defense immediately rang hollow. The Frankenstein metaphor wasn't a minor detail buried in a lengthy article. It was the central point of the content she had amplified. She had deliberately chosen to give that specific comparison greater reach and visibility. Collins didn't let the deflection stand. She pushed back, noting that Omar had added her own commentary that suggested agreement with the characterization. Omar's response became more agitated. She shifted between different defensive strategies, minimizing the significance of what she had shared, questioning why people were making such a big deal about it, and ultimately suggesting that her critics were acting in bad faith. This kind of defensive posture is politically toxic because it makes someone appear both callous about their original actions and petulant about facing consequences. Voters watching the exchange didn't see someone taking accountability or showing genuine reflection. They saw someone trying to argue their way out of trouble without acknowledging the legitimate reasons why people were upset. The citizenship question created an even more difficult dynamic for Omar. When Collins raised Trump's allegations about her marriage and immigration history, Omar's response was telling. She insisted somewhat desperately that she was an American citizen and couldn't be deported. While technically accurate, the nervous energy with which she delivered this response suggested deeper anxiety. Here's what Omar failed to understand in that moment. Trump's goal wasn't actually to get her deported. It was to plant doubt about her legitimacy and credibility. By responding so defensively to the deportation question, Omar inadvertently validated Trump's strategy. She looked like someone who was genuinely worried about the allegations, which made viewers wonder if there might be substance behind them. Omar also made a critical tactical error by dismissing people calling for her deportation as idiots who don't understand basic civics. This kind of condescension plays terribly with average voters. Even people who might have been sympathetic to her position were turned off by the obvious contempt she displayed for citizens expressing their views, however misguided those views might be. The pattern continued across multiple media appearances and social media responses. Instead of showing humility, Omar projected defensiveness. Instead of acknowledging that reasonable people might find her timing and tone inappropriate, she framed criticism as politically motivated attacks. Instead of expressing empathy for Kirk's family, she focused on defending her own actions and reputation. Political professionals watching this unfold recognized a classic mistake. Omar was treating a character crisis as if it were a policy disagreement. You can argue policy positions all day long. But when voters question your basic judgment and decency, arguing rarely helps. What people want to see is reflection, growth, and genuine accountability. What Omar needed was a moment of genuine human vulnerability, an acknowledgement that she had made a mistake in timing and tone, that grief and memorial services should transcend political disagreements, that Kirk's family deserved better than what she had provided. Such a statement, delivered with sincerity, might have diffused much of the criticism and allowed her to move forward. Instead, Omar chose to fight every criticism, to defend every decision, to reframe every attack as evidence of bigotry or bad faith. This approach might satisfy her most loyal supporters, but it alienated the broader public whose perception matters for long-term political viability. Omar's isolation became increasingly apparent as the controversy dragged on. In typical political controversies, party members rally around their colleagues, especially when facing attacks from the opposing party. But in Omar's case, the support was notably muted. Some Democratic colleagues offered generic statements about moving forward and focusing on policy. Others remained completely silent. Very few were willing to explicitly defend Omar's comments about Kirk or her handling of the subsequent firestorm. This silence spoke volumes about her standing within the party. Behind the scenes, according to various reports, the situation was even more dire. Democratic leadership was reportedly frustrated with Omar for creating an unnecessary distraction. Donors expressed reluctance to be associated with someone generating such negative coverage. Progressive organizations that might normally defend a member facing conservative attacks were notably quiet. This political isolation isn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. It's about power and influence. When your colleagues won't defend you, when donors back away, when allied organizations keep their distance, your ability to function effectively as a legislator is severely compromised. Committees don't want you. Leadership doesn't trust you with important messaging. Your leverage in negotiations evaporates. Omar's approval ratings also began showing concerning trends. While she maintained strong support within her specific district, her national favorability numbers deteriorated significantly. For a politician with apparent national ambitions, this kind of reputation damage is extremely difficult to reverse. The contrast with other progressive figures was stark. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders faced conservative attacks, progressive activists and Democratic colleagues typically rushed to their defense. But when Omar found herself in crisis, the response was tepid at best. This difference reflected a growing perception that Omar had become more of a political liability than an asset. The Kirk controversy became the culmination of a pattern. It wasn't just about one inappropriate post. It was about a series of moments that suggested poor judgment, insensitivity, and a tendency to prioritize provocation over persuasion. That pattern made it much harder for potential defenders to argue that Omar deserved the benefit of the doubt. Political capital once spent is difficult to rebuild. Omar discovered that even within her own party, there are limits to how many times colleagues will defend controversial statements before deciding the political cost is too high. She had reached that limit, and the consequences were becoming increasingly clear. Her defensive spiral also revealed something about the nature of modern political accountability. In an era when every statement is recorded, analyzed, and amplified, politicians cannot rely on controversies simply fading away. The permanent nature of digital content means that Omar's comments about Kirk will remain searchable and quotable for the rest of her career, ready to be deployed by opponents in future campaigns. The confrontation between Omar and Trump wasn't just about two political figures clashing. It exposed deeper fault lines in American politics and raised fundamental questions about leadership, accountability, and the boundaries of acceptable discourse. One crucial dimension was the security situation at Kirk's memorial. An armed individual was arrested at State Farm Stadium claiming to be conducting private security sweeps. This incident, while not directly caused by any single person's rhetoric, highlighted the real-world consequences of inflammatory political discourse. When politicians use dehumanizing language, when they suggest certain people's legacies deserve to be erased, when they mock death and loss, it can contribute to an environment where some individuals feel justified taking extreme actions. The security concerns at Kirk's memorial required massive law enforcement presence, roadblocks, fencing, hundreds of officers. This isn't normal for a memorial service, but it reflected the toxic climate surrounding the event. This raised uncomfortable questions about political responsibility. To what extent are political figures accountable for how their rhetoric might be interpreted or acted upon by others? Omar certainly didn't tell anyone to threaten violence or bring weapons to the memorial, but her comments contributed to an atmosphere of anger and division that had tangible security implications. The law enforcement response to the memorial illustrated just how seriously authorities took the threat environment. Multiple agencies coordinated to ensure the safety of attendees, including the president and vice president, who announced they would attend. Bomb-sniffing dogs swept the venue. Snipers positioned themselves on rooftops. Metal detectors screened every person entering. The security operation resembled what you'd see at a major sporting event or presidential inauguration. The fact that honoring a deceased activist required this level of security says something troubling about where we are as a country. It suggests that our political discourse has become so toxic, our divisions so deep, that even mourning the dead cannot happen without fear of violence. The controversy also sparked widespread public education about citizenship and naturalization laws. Most Americans had never heard of denaturalization, the legal process by which citizenship can be revoked under specific circumstances. Trump's allegations forced a national conversation about when and how this process might apply. The law is clear. If someone provided false information during the naturalization process, particularly about identity, relationships, or criminal history, that can trigger denaturalization proceedings. Serious crimes, especially those related to terrorism or treason, can also result in citizenship being revoked. The process requires court proceedings and isn't automatic, but it is legally possible. The standards for denaturalization are deliberately high. The government must prove not just that false information was provided, but that the false information was material to the naturalization decision. Additionally, there's typically a statute of limitations on when proceedings can be initiated. These protections exist because citizenship is considered a fundamental status that shouldn't be easily stripped away. Whether Omar's specific situation involved any such issues remained unclear and unproven, but the mere fact that Americans were learning about these processes and considering their application to a sitting member of Congress represented a significant shift in discourse. Questions about loyalty, legitimacy, and the responsibilities of citizenship moved from the margins to mainstream political conversation. The generational divide in reactions to the controversy was particularly noteworthy. Older Americans, especially those who lived through periods when patriotism and loyalty were central to political identity, responded to the controversy with particular intensity. For many in this demographic, Omar represented a troubling departure from shared values about respect, decency, and national unity. They remember when American politicians, regardless of party, generally agreed on certain fundamental premises about American exceptionalism and the importance of national cohesion. They remember when political disagreements, however heated, stopped at certain boundaries. They remember when mocking someone's death would have been universally condemned as beyond the pale. For these voters, Omar's comments symbolized something larger than one incident. They represented what feels like a broader cultural shift toward a political environment where nothing is sacred, where every moment is an opportunity for partisan point scoring, where empathy and decency have been sacrificed on the altar of ideological purity. The expectation among older Americans is that certain behaviors remain constant across generations. Respecting the deceased is one of those behaviors. Showing compassion to grieving families is another. Supporting national unity in times of loss is a third. When these expectations are violated, it creates a sense of cultural dislocation that goes beyond normal political disagreement. Younger Americans often viewed the same events through a different lens. Many saw the focus on Omar's comments as disproportionate given Kirk's own controversial statements and political positions. They questioned why civility was suddenly so important when it came to a conservative figure, while progressive activists facing threats and harassment often receive less public sympathy. This generational divide reflects broader tensions about how we navigate political disagreement in a pluralistic democracy. Is there a shared set of values and norms that should transcend partisan differences? Or is such thinking naive in an era where political divisions reflect fundamentally different visions of what America should be? The question has no easy answer. But the Omar Kirk controversy forced Americans to grapple with it in concrete rather than abstract terms. It wasn't a theoretical debate about political philosophy. It was a real-world situation where people had to decide whether certain behaviors crossed lines that should be universally respected. The symbolic dimension of the Omar-Trump clash cannot be overstated. Omar has become, intentionally or not, a symbol of multicultural progressivism. The idea that America's future lies in embracing global perspectives, questioning traditional institutions, and reimagining national identity. Her journey from Somali refugee to U.S. congresswoman represents, to her supporters, the beautiful promise of American opportunity and inclusion. Her critics see something very different. They view her as someone who takes American generosity for granted while working to undermine American interests and values. They point to her criticisms of American foreign policy, her support for movements they consider anti-American, and her willingness to compare the United States unfavorably to other nations. For these critics, Omar represents not the fulfillment of American promise, but a threat to American identity. While Trump positioned himself as the counterweight, embodying what might be called defensive nationalism, the belief that American leaders should prioritize American interests, that immigration should serve American needs, and that American values are worth preserving rather than constantly interrogating. His appeal rests partly on the promise to protect traditional American identity against perceived threats. This symbolic battle helps explain why their clash resonated so powerfully. It wasn't really about one post or one memorial service, it was about competing visions of American identity, loyalty, and leadership. Voters weren't just choosing between two political figures, they were choosing between two fundamentally different conceptions of what America is and should become. The long-term political consequences for Omar remain unclear but concerning. The likelihood of formal censure by the House increased significantly. While largely symbolic, censure creates a permanent record of congressional disapproval that follows a politician throughout their career. For someone with potential national ambitions, such a mark is extremely damaging. More significantly, Omar faces credibility damage that may be irreversible. In politics, reputation is currency. Once voters see you as someone who lacks basic judgment or human decency, winning back that trust becomes extraordinarily difficult. Every future statement or action gets filtered through that established narrative about character and judgment. Trump's move, meanwhile, was strategically masterful. He reinforced loyalty among his base, positioned himself as a defender of traditional values, and created a clear contrast that would benefit him politically. His appearance at Kirk's memorial, his statements about decency and respect, his willingness to confront what he portrayed as Omar's moral bankruptcy, all of this served his broader political narrative about defending America against progressive excess. The lessons from this controversy will echo through American politics for years. They touch on fundamental questions about speech and responsibility, identity and belonging, political strategy and moral leadership that will continue shaping how we choose our leaders and how those leaders govern. So what's the real lesson here? Omar learned that political survival requires more than policy positions. It demands judgment and basic decency. Trump exploited her mistake brilliantly. For voters, this moment clarified a simple question. Do we accept leaders who mock death or demand better? Share your thoughts below.